please, to welcome Dr. Chris Buttigieg, Chief Officer of Strategy, Policy and Innovation at MFSA, Marika Tonna, CEO of Business First, Andrew Zammit, Managing Partner of GVZH Advocates, and Matthew Camilleri, CEO and Founder of Castille. Could I ask each of you, please, to come to the stage? And you can sit in any order over here that you would like. Thank you. Okay, so first and foremost, I'm going to turn to you first, Dr. Chris, and that is that we've just seen a couple of case studies here, one person coming from the US with a view to setting up in Malta, and in a different scenario, or scenario, as the Maltese say. In the second case, then we had a French company who wanted to set up an office here with a view to gaining access to the expat community. So can I ask you, first and foremost, with this in mind, what are the initiatives, both operational and planned, to develop the regulatory framework from an MFSA point of view?
Good morning. Actually, it's good afternoon, everyone. Well, we have started a number of initiatives, which probably most of them you have already heard about. The Fintech strategy, which we're currently working on, and we've just issued our feedback statement to the consultation, which we issued in January. And we are planning a consultation on the regulatory sandbox, which will be issued later on in the coming weeks. We're also working on a capital market strategy. We started a major revision of our listing rules, which have been there since 2002, and we want to modernize these listing rules and make them more applicable to today's dynamic capital markets, to make our capital market more accessible, especially to foreign issuers and international players. We're also working on other ideas and projects. For example, in the area of virtual financial assets, so far, the framework treats these assets as an asset class for investment purposes. However, as probably most of you know, this asset class is also used as a means of payment. Now, that's a different type of regime that would need to be established in order to allow these assets to be treated as a means of payment. And it's a very challenging idea, because it is something that would not only require a regulatory framework, but would also require detailed discussions with central bankers and with the ECB to understand how this could work in practice, with the intervention of these institutions. But it's something new, it's something innovative, and it's something which bankers abroad, also like JP Morgan, are currently working on. So having a framework for crypto assets to be used as a means of payment. Other ideas which we're currently working on, and which should allow business to develop in an environment which is regulated and in a way which is acceptable also to our European and international peers, are, for example, the idea of having a passport for depositories, which was something that Malta pushed during the AIFMD negotiations way back in 2009. Today, we're seeing that there's going to be an AIFMD review. Probably it's going to happen by the end of this year. And this is, again, an idea which we're currently working on to see whether, through discussions with our peers, other regulators, the European Commission and other institutions, we could, again, have this as a potential new framework within the AIFMD. And the arguments are there. They have been made in the past, again, something that we can do in the future. More developments that we're currently undertaking to make, again, business more accessible to the island, whilst, again, being very prudent in terms of making sure that our supervisory framework remains robust and that we weed out the bad apples, is the reorganization of the MFSA, whereby through the reorganization, we're making sure that the supervisory functions that until today were responsible also for policy, for strategy, for enforcement, can focus primarily on supervision. And that we have the resources that we require in order to be more responsive. So again, this is from the supervisory element, and it's also an initiative that will make sure that as a regulator, we are more effective, more efficient in the way we deliver our job.
Before I go on, because I'd like to pick up on a couple of those points, particularly how the supervisory function, as you say, is to weed out the bad apples, is distinct from a couple of different approaches on that. Could I ask the team, please, we'd like to just hear from Simon Barberi, the Director of EU Advisory Services from Ernst & Young. Could we just play that video, please? And I'd just like to go to Marika after that.
These two case studies reflect the different elements that are needed by any country to attract foreign investment into it, and which are researched by our annual survey. Up to 3/4 of our respondents believe that Malta is attractive for FDI. This is important as it continues to drive investment in a number of areas, be they the traditional ones, as well as those coming from the more technologically driven and innovative areas. It is interesting to note that these investors plan to come to Malta accompanied by their family members and employees, coming from the EU but also from third countries. This is relevant because our respondents indicate that aside from the often mentioned levels of corporate taxation, it is our social climate and quality of life which attract investment to our shores. Respondents also believe that Malta is keeping pace with the regulatory changes that are happening across the globe. This also offers Malta a globally competitive position in their particular sectors, and this is especially relevant for financial services respondents. Ultimately, these perceptions will continue to drive and retain FDI in our country, as is being proposed by these two case studies.
Marika, I have two questions. The first is that Simon mentioned that 3/4 of respondents feel Malta is attractive for FDI. And from that point of view, I'd be interested in your view, because I know you're exceptionally experienced in that, and if you could comment on that in light with Brexit. But secondly is Dr. Chris's point around using the supervisory mechanisms to weed out the bad apples, because particularly Simon mentioned there how Malta is seen as keeping pace with regulatory movements. Could you just provide your own perspective on that too?
Yes. When it comes to FDI, Malta has been very successful in FDI. I mean, I come from Malta Enterprise, and we have been set up for 52 years now. And over the years, we've attracted a number of companies, and the first company that actually set up here what was then MDC is still here. It was Malta Rubber then, it's called something else, but it's still here. However, the scenario of FDI is changing, and in the ecosystem, we're seeing more and more SME startups, which we'd like to attract to Malta. So whilst in the past we attracted the larger companies, and like somebody said earlier, the best way to set up in Malta is go to a multiplier, go to a service provider, and it is the service provider's role to go round all the bureaucracy, whatever bureaucracy there is. With the small startups, it's different. They set up their own little companies here. We want to attract to Malta the big boys, yes, but we also want to attract the future TransferWises of the world now, the small innovative companies that are very, very important in this ecosystem. And that is where we at Business First come in, because we handhold these small companies, whether they're local, whether they're foreign, to register their business. Like you said, we introduce them formally to the regulator. We set up meetings for them there. They can come to Business First, or they go to the regulators. We explain to them all the incentives. So in that area, that is where we as Business First are coming in with the startups. An important role which we have as well is that we work horizontally. It's okay, it is music to my ears what MFSA are doing with regulations, that they are working with industry, that is the way to go. They talked about sandboxes, which is fantastic, because sandboxes is operating with innovative ideas, but with different regulations or outside the regulatory environment to test the regulatory environment. However, any company that operates in Malta or out of Malta does not deal just with MFSA. They have to pay taxes, they have to recruit people. Like we saw in the case study, they bring over their nanny from a third country, who is a third country national. And that is where the ease of doing business team comes in, where we try to simplify procedures, amalgamate government services. We're doing that physically at Business First, where we have a number of entities there, but now we're going a step further, where we're introducing a business portal, whereby our dream is that companies operating out of Malta would be able to interact with government completely online. There are approximately 50 different government entities that have some sort of contact with business. Some on a daily basis, like the Commissioner of Revenue, some much less, so very focused on a particular industry. But we're trying to bring all their services virtually on this platform.
And just if you could maybe elaborate on the point regarding regulation as well?
Yes, and in the past, I think regulators used to regulate to sort of control the free riders, control the bad apples. I mean, that is not the way to go. A lot of times, regulations used to be changed because there was one smart business person who found a loophole and then introduced more regulation, which would have been unfair on the honest, motivated business. That is not the way to regulate. The way to regulate is have a simple enabling act and then have legal notices which can be changed with the innovation that is going on, because the world of business is changing constantly. You cannot have an act and leave it there, cast in stone for years and years, because you have to work constantly with the operators, you have to work constantly with business. It's always a balancing act, because you have to protect the consumer, you have to protect the public, but regulation is also about protecting the honest businessman. It is about protecting the motivators. And the challenge is how to legislate and how to regulate innovation, because so many new things are coming into the market that whoever's legislating it, it's not easy to keep up with the changes. Up to now, we seem to be doing very well with legislating for AI and other things, but then, there is a bit of a dichotomy, because then you have the courts, which are still stuck in a different world. So how do we bring them on board as well? Because as I said, when you operate in Malta, you don't just deal with MFSA, you deal with many entities. So that is the challenge there.
Well, just before I go to Matthew on a separate point, Dr. Chris is chomping at the bit here to respond to that, so I'd like to give you that opening.
Indeed, this is music to my ears. In the sense, I'm very much in favor of principle-based regulation rather than rules-based regulation. But we have to accept the reality that we are operating within a European environment.
Yes, that is true.
And that the European institutions are the leaders in terms of the regulation which applies on the island. And they are also becoming the leaders in terms of the supervisory approach that needs to be put in place by entities like the MFSA. There's a concept which has been developing over the past 15 years, which is supervisory convergence, where even the manner we supervise is being over time harmonized at European level. However, there are areas where it is the member state which is the competent legislator. And that's an area like, for example, the area of crypto assets, where there hasn't been a European initiative so far. And there we have applied the idea of having a principle-based approach, where we have applied high-level regulation to the industry, allowing space for innovation. Now, again, even Europe is rethinking the way it's doing its legislation and its regulation. And there's a whole debate at the moment about how to better apply the principle of proportionality to allow more space for small companies to enter the market and to grow, and then eventually a higher degree and more detailed regulation applies to that company once it grows. This is a discussion which is ongoing right now. And if you see the speeches of ECB responsible officials, and officials coming from ABA in particular, you'll notice that proportionality is high on the agenda.
So I'm going to just come in on that conversation and say, that's all great, but you need people in order to do so. And one of the key things that Simon mentioned in the video, and this is why, Matthew, I'd like to go to you on this, he says that apart from the oft-quoted corporation tax, it's social, climate and quality of life that really attracts people here, because in order to facilitate what both Marika and Dr. Chris are talking about is you do need people. So the thing is that it's not just the sun is going to bring anybody to Malta. It's lovely, but it's not obviously going to be enough. Salaries come into play. So what I'd be interested to hear from you is, well, how do salaries in Malta compare to international norms? And if they don't meet them, what non-pay compensation is available within the industry?
So good afternoon. So I think the long and short of it is it's important to take an international view rather than just a local one. So we've had 5 to 10 years of quite fast growth locally. So we've had a number of clusters who use very similar skill sets, both in financial skills and also tech skills. And that's had quite an effect on local salaries. So with the exception of a few clusters, which bring over expats on international packages, most hires are local ones, are done on local scales. And those local scales have seen significant wage inflation in the last 5 to 10 years. We actually run a publication, a salary benchmark, and we update it every 6 months. Now, are we sort of in line with Western Europe yet? No, we're not. We're still removed from that, at least in most skills profiles. So we are a bit in between. I don't think we're at a point where we can attract even people from the East European region on the basis of salaries. Okay, because despite our taxes being quite competitive, we're still not at that stage. Obviously, when people are looking to migrate for careers, and if you look at international work trends, I don't think there's ever been a time in history where there's been as much white-collar migration. But that's usually very concentrated towards the very big clusters, and it's difficult to compete on the financial packages being offered. As you said, sun is definitely not enough. However, maybe one thing playing in our favor, my opinion, is twofold. I think the first is that the workforce is increasingly made up of millennials. And whilst the sun may not be enough, our lifestyle and the reputation of our lifestyle definitely is an important component. Millennials value work-life balance a lot more, so these are things they look at. And I think Malta has a very unique proposition there, and I think we should take care of it. I think the second thing is that whilst having attracted established business, we're also becoming a bit of a hotbed for innovation, technology, and startups. And that in particular is quite appealing to millennials who specialize in these areas.
The point that I'm actually picking up from there is about the white-collar migration in particular, because as you say, there's a huge amount here on offer, and I mean, I alluded to quite a lot of that in the beginning from a business point of view. From a lifestyle point of view, I'd have to agree completely as well. And on the point of white-collar migration, because that was what the last 2 case studies were all about, before I come to you, Andrew, I'd just like to talk to you about particularly schooling and education. But before I do, could I ask for the next, for the team, please, to play 2 videos for me? The first one is from Lara Zammit from the Migrant Learners Unit, and the second one from Dermot Galea, CEO Foundation for Education Services, please.
8 schools in Malta are grouped into 11 colleges. Families coming from EU countries can just register at their locality at the office of the principal, while others coming from non-EU countries have to register at our offices at the Ministry of Education in Floriana. Once students start attending school and start to have language problems, the school will then contact us at the Migrant Learners Unit, and we will seek into offering our in-class services in English and Maltese. We also offer another option where we have a 1-year induction course for those students who have no skill to communicate in both languages. During this 1-year course, we don't only teach English and Maltese, but we also offer other academic subjects such as maths, English, and which will help them and then fit into the mainstream after the next scholastic year.
The Foundation for Educational Services welcomes all parents from all over the world. As an entity, we provide services such as childcare service, Club 316, which is an after-school program, and Schola Saif, which is a summer school program for children between the ages of 3 months and 16 years. Our services are there to support working parents while their children are in a safe educational environment. The childcare service runs from 7 till 4 in the evening, from Monday to Friday. Club 316, our after-school program, runs from 2:30 till 6 in the afternoon and during holidays from 7 in the morning till 5:30, whilst our Schola Saif, the summer school program, runs in 34 centres from 7 in the morning till 5:30 and in other 30 centres from 8:30 till 12:30.
So childcare is sorted, Andrew?
I beg your pardon?
Childcare is sorted, is
Childcare
it?
is sorted. Childcare is sorted. It's not. I'm warning first and foremost, I'm not an immigration lawyer, but as a corporate and regulatory lawyer, I come into contact with many clients who are looking, to go through this decision making, to see how do I move wife, family, nanny if need be, and get everything integrated into this new jurisdiction where I'm planning to start a new chapter. So this is a really big deal for people. They don't just wake up in the morning one day, and this at least is not the norm, that they decide to move country, job, and all. So childcare is one of the, I think, key considerations that we find clients mulling over for some time, because it is a natural instinct as a parent to want to give your kids the best education that you possibly could. When they're young, you can't really conceive them being educated at a distance from you, so boarding school is not really on the cards. I think, regardless of what we're listening to in these video clips, I think this is very much a strong sort of the government's angle on what they are doing for education, which I know is a very good initiative, but it is certainly not the default pattern that you would follow with expats moving to Malta. What expats would be looking for is for private schools, quality education, again, not to denigrate the government's education system, but what they were looking for is like international baccalaureate programs. So this is where we get questions, and again, we have a limit of how much we can guide our clients, but we can give them the pointers on the lay of the landscape. They tend to go to the key international schools that are present here, which are quite full in terms of headcount student populations there. So it isn't that easy to get your kids in, and I understand after some toing and froing and after some juggling to see what kids are vacating their positions in class and what others can be absorbed, then that is usually a key pivotal point of the decision making of yes, the family can move. I had a conversation only 2 weeks ago with a client who did the same thing, moving from London to here, and only gave us the green light when his kids were accepted into Verdala school, for example. So it's not as easy as maybe it seems, and I think we have to invest more in private schooling, definitely.
And Matthew outlined a range of reasons why an individual might come to these shores, and particularly Marika and Dr. Chris spoke about the business reasons why one would come to these shores. What else do you think, from an individual point of view, attracts people to Malta?
Look, we always talk about ease of doing business in Malta, and you touched upon it in your introductory note before we started, how it's easy to get to decision makers within the country because it is a small country. If you talk about 6 degrees of separation anywhere in the world, you're talking about 1 or 2 degrees of separation in Malta. So that in itself makes things more accessible, more amenable. It's not to say that things are done in an improper way, but the fact that you can get to a decision maker to tell me, listen, does this work, yes or no, and how can we resolve it? Again, I mean, in the run-up to Brexit, which was planned for the end of March, there was a lot of stress building up to applicants who had this tightening noose around their neck, who needed to get their business organized in Malta before the Brexit date came. And the MFSA appreciated this fully. So just to take an example of that, they would actually sit around the table with the 3 key people who are deciding on the various aspects of the application to give active feedback there and then to make sure that when we submitted the paperwork, we were going to be hitting exactly what they were looking for in exactly the way they were looking for it. So this dialogue with the regulator, so we talk about friendly regulators, yes, but an accessible regulator is, I think, key to be able to know where you stand, what they expect of you, and to have a really open and honest relationship with them to deliver what they need. So I think this is key to doing business in Malta, not only because we focused a lot on the MFSA because this is a Finance Malta conference, but there are other authorities that certainly deserve mention, like the Gaming Authority, like the Telecommunications Authority. You know, they are accessible when you need them. They do give you the feedback that you require to be able to get things done.
Marika, can I come back to you on this? Because I'm hearing name after name after name, and endearingly so, and with compliments. But you mentioned 50 different government entities. So can I ask you...
Depending on which sector you're in, because if you're in agriculture, you will only deal with agriculture. But
sure.
yes, there are many different entities that can deal with business.
And is there a way in which you think that bureaucracy could be reduced? Apart from, you mentioned the business portal where...
Yes, it can be reduced in many ways. One, we're trying to, I know that the principal permanent secretary really believes in the once only principle, and he's given instructions, and this would be assisted with the portal, although there are certain GDPR issues which we have to overcome, that when one entity asks for a piece of information, then that is shared across other entities. So if always subject to GDPR regulations, if you give your accounts to entity A and then it's needed by entity B, if the client gives permission, then it would automatically be shared. Then there are even other principles which we are trying to introduce as well. If you need the VAT number of a company, you ask the VAT department, you don't ask the company. If you need my birth certificate, you know, it's a public document, you get it from the public registry, don't ask me to supply you with my birth certificate. So these are principles which we are trying to introduce across government, across different entities. We're also trying to get them to talk together. A few years ago, the College of Regulators was set up, whereby all the regulators sit on the same table, share experiences, try to learn from each other. They might come from different sectors. You know, you have planning authority there and you have MFSA there. But we talk about the principles of regulation and how we can improve and how we can make life easier for our clients. You know, I've been doing public sector consultancy before I joined ME for almost 20 years, and I met entities when my first meeting was like, why are you talking to us about clients? We are regulators, you know, we don't have clients. Thank God that mentality over the years has changed. Mm-hmm. Because before, everyone used to see themselves like, I had one client, a public sector entity, who told me, do the police have clients? I'm a regulator, I don't have clients, I control. And slowly, we've managed over the years to change the attitude, and here we are listening to the accessibility of the regulators, how they're ready to discuss with their clients, and try to make life easy for their clients, because it's a win-win situation for all.
Matthew, I'd like to come back to you on that, about making life easy, about making life accessible. And again, we need people in order to do that. Something I mentioned when I started off is that Malta isn't perfect. It does need international expertise. It's hungry to go and find it. So if a company does come here and it goes through the portal that currently Marika and her team are seeking to build, as Dr. Chris says, that they work with the regulators. As Andrew says, they come in and that they see the ease of doing business and they get there as fast as they can. Where or how is Malta going to attract the deep or the niche expertise required to drive this country on?
So I think, obviously, the first place is home, right? So I think if there's one thing going for Malta is that we're nimble. The education system is nimble. If you look at, again, internationally, I think one of the reasons why there's a shortage of talent everywhere is the fact that the skills requirements of economies is changing so quickly that the the education sectors can't keep up. So locally, we're nimble. We can respond quite quickly to the needs of industry, changing industry. We also, obviously, that will never be enough. We do need to remain attractive to foreign people wanting to come in. I think we also have to appreciate that the world of work is changing quite fast. So whereas before companies had all of their employees, all of their talent under one roof, today it's different. In fact, when we have companies coming to us and saying, listen, we need 40, 50 Java developers, what we tell them is, listen, we'll build your core team locally, and it will be a strong team, and you'll have your core domain knowledge in that team, but then we'll scale that team, possibly even remotely, okay? So the new world of work is changing, and I think sort of, whereas in Malta, our size makes these trends a bit more conspicuous, we obviously suffer from the same trends we see internationally. So I think in a nutshell, we need to use our size, our nimbleness, and the fact that we're an attractive place to work. To attract people in, we need to carry on making sure our education sector is responsive, and sort of linking up with what my fellow speakers are saying, we need to keep innovative in the kinds of companies we're attracting. Because let's face it, people, digital workers, are very keen on innovation. So if we're being innovative on regulation, for example, we're attracting the right companies with the right operations, the right business plans, with the right technologies, and that in itself attracts talent.
I think, and again, I agree with much of what you say. I think we have to be careful with the word innovative, and the reason I think that is that it can be a cliche that doesn't give an awful lot of substance to it, and I know that this panel is full of substance on that point. Dr. Crisp, I'd like to bring you back in at this point, but before I do, could I just get the views, please, of Raman Bondan, who is CEO of Dolphin Asset Services, who particularly makes reference to innovation, and I'd really like if you could respond to this, please, Dr. Crisp.
Cost competitiveness, innovative product proposition, and accessibility to the regulator have always been key success factors when fund managers and fund promoters in general have decided to set up shop in Malta and passport their services to the EU. It is very important that from the very beginning, fund promoters and their advisors select the right service providers that can service them throughout the lifetime of the fund, and not from the very beginning, across all levels, from non-executive directors to fund administrators and risk and compliance function. It is even more important to select the right custodian that can give, on one hand, access to the right markets, asset classes, and financial instruments, and on the other hand, provide peace of mind to the investors that are coming into the fund.
So, Dr. Chris, cost competitiveness, innovative product propositions, and access to the regulator. This is what Raman Bondan says are key. So would you like to perhaps pick up on this and niche down on what the MFSA is doing on all three? Particularly, as I say, I'd be particularly interested in the innovation side.
Before that, I'd like to react a bit in relation to the education aspect mentioned by Matthew. We are working on education as an institution. We are looking at where we need to strengthen our staff and strengthen particularly new staff. We're recruiting, we're growing a lot at the moment. We're going to grow from around 360 to 500 within the next 2 years. And as all of you that have experienced us or that have worked with us, you'll appreciate that financial supervisors don't grow on trees. So whilst we're making a lot of effort to recruit, we're also making an effort to have our own academy for financial supervisors, which is one of the targets we have for the next 2 years, where we will be training our staff in techniques in relation to financial supervision, where we'll be training our staff on new regulatory frameworks that are being coming up particularly from the EU and the ESAs. The idea of the academy is also to have a venue where we can invite other regulators over to train our staff, but not only to train our staff, but also to get training from the academy, which from an international point of view is very important because it helps the links we have with other regulators. Again, I think this is, as Matthew was saying, this is a very important point. The economy is growing, the financial sector is growing. Without capacity, we can't grow further. And to have capacity is not only an issue of finding people, but it's also an issue of training people and making sure that they have the right skill set to deliver. Which brings me to the next point, which is the point on innovation, which is the point on accessibility. To continue innovating, to continue being accessible, again, it's an issue of ideas, it's an issue of resources. And therefore, again, this point of education, not only from an MFSA point of view, but from a national point of view, is very important. And one of the institutions, and I must admit I have a conflict of interest because I'm a lecturer at the university, but one of the institutions which is very important in this regard is the University of Malta, where there are developments there, again, which are important to ensure that we have new, fresh graduates that are competent in the fields, in the new fields that are developing in the financial sector. And for example, we've got an institute now at the university, which is an institute for DLT, which is offering courses for professionals coming both from a legal, banking, finance, and IT background that are interested in this area and want to grow in this field. Again, banking and finance department at the university has come up with a course on blockchain and crypto assets, an idea that came up last year, and within a period of 6 months it was up and running. And this is what we need to continue doing in order to be able to innovate and to be able to have the capacity to be able to continue growing in this field. Having an education system which is at the forefront, which is seeing what is happening abroad, what can be done locally, and educating the new generation in these new fields.
I'd like to pick up with you, Andrew, on this, and that is that it's really, really great to hear all that is being done. And whether it is reduction bureaucracy, whether it is, scaling teams remotely, whether it is engaging with the education sector and almost bringing it in-house as distinct from out-house, what are the barriers? What are the barriers? What do you hear that people are saying if they choose not to come here? Or what do you think needs to be done that hasn't been discussed yet, that needs to be addressed?
Okay, so pain points, the fun part. There are pain points. There are definitely pain points which are clear to everyone in the industry. The banking environment has become very difficult because of international factors, maybe some local factors too, but when you start getting names like the biggest banks in Europe, which we used to look at as the bastions of everything right and straight, are getting hit by money laundering not allegations, but they're actually involved in money laundering activities, then that starts becoming, gives it more context. Money laundering is going to be a risk that we're going to be facing as an industry on an ongoing basis. You don't work in financial services with zero risk of money laundering. It's going to be there. It's about how vigilant we are, how reactive we are, how effective we are in enforcing. So pain points that I would summarize this would, the whole banking environment is a pain point in itself, but that is something that has to evolve, and I'm sure solutions will be found because business is pragmatic, and with a problem, a solution is going to be presented sooner or later. It's going to be the problem is how long it's going to take for something to present itself, for the banking landscape to change and evolve a little bit. That is all something we're watching with a lot of interest in that space. I think the lack of human resources, or how difficult it is to find human resources, as Matthew said, there are solutions which many businesses are implementing to have multiple sites based on the skills and where those skills are located. So yes, Malta tends to be a component within a number of companies or operations where Malta adds its bit based on what it is that they are looking to do better in Malta. And Malta certainly has its proposition for these innovative fintech solutions, particularly even in traditional businesses like insurance, and let's not forget even asset management, which has been so important to Malta's evolution as a financial services industry. And when we're talking about innovation, I think we should also keep thinking of innovation in the context of traditional existing businesses too. Let's not just look at let's be innovative in something which is totally new, but even in the new channels which traditional businesses is using. And I think there we're evolving. I think those would be the main points that I would pick up as difficulties.
The banking environment, lack of HR, and incremental innovation would be the three key ones.
Yeah.
Marika, what Dr. Chris described about bringing the education, taking responsibility for the education by bringing it in-house, as well as engaging with the University of Malta and developing new courses in line with what the educational and employment needs of the country are. That is an example of one institution talking to another, or one institution thinking differently. You mentioned earlier that you'd like to see the authorities talking to each other more. Are there any other tangible examples like that you could share with us?
Us as Malta Enterprise, we work very, very closely with the Ministry for Education on various levels. For example, for us, the fact that there aren't enough private schools is a business opportunity to go out there and bring an international school to Malta. That is on one level. Like we got BOTS, which is a top medical school in the UK, if not the world. But we also work very closely with education with regards to skills. For example, when the first MRO companies were setting up in Malta, and one of the very first one was Lufthansa Technik, we didn't have enough adequate skills. Actually, the course that was offered by MCAST, we brought MCAST and Lufthansa together, and it was actually Lufthansa Technik who wrote the course for MCAST, because it was the first company here. Then eventually they trained enough students for us to build the MRO industry. And I think there are other sectors whereby the Ministry for Education is very willing to work with industry to help industry develop the courses, because sometimes the lecturers are a bit cut off from what is happening out there, because it's such a fast-moving world today that they might not be so much in touch with the business world, especially in industries that are very fast-moving and innovative. And we've always found the Ministry for Education very open to discuss at all levels, from preserving traditional crafts to these leading-edge technologies. When you've asked about the challenges, and I think for me personally, I think skills are the most worrying, because if we want to move up the value chain, we need to have highly skilled people in Malta. And don't forget, children join the education system here in Malta at 3-4 years. They join the labor force 15, 16, 20 years later. So the students that are entering school today are going to live in a completely different world to us living today. So it's a big challenge even for the educators.
Before we elaborate on this, I would just like, I believe that there is a question that has come from the audience.
Yes, absolutely. I've been keeping an eye on Slido, and quite a few questions have been coming through. Most of them have been answered already. There have been 2 or 3 which I'm now condensing into one, and possibly are geared more towards the recruitment side, and essentially are along the lines of there is an inherent conflict of interest perhaps within the world of recruitment. There is a commercial driver that recruiters have to place as many people as they possibly can, but then there is the interest on the other side to provide real skills to the market. And there is a feeling somewhere in these questions that perhaps recruiters push through resources that are not necessarily the best resources that one could hope. And what is the position and the reaction to this?
That's for you, Matthew, for
guess
sure.
that's for me. Yes. No, recruitment has a very bad reputation internationally, and obviously the same conflict of interest exists in Malta. The thing about Malta is that it's a very small place, and you build a reputation, good or bad, very quickly. Obviously, the shortage makes that conflict even more likely, because it's a bit of a zero-sum game. But at the end of the day, it's no different to any other industry. You need sustainable relationships, and therefore you need to look around for solutions in order to change that zero-sum into a win-win as much as you can. A lot of the solutions you already mentioned, I don't want to repeat myself, but training, attracting people from overseas, reskilling, attracting people across different sectors. So for example, one thing we found quite interesting is that when we met with a lot of blockchain investors, they wanted digital workers, but often they were quite open to say, listen, we don't need people with blockchain experience. We'll take a good Java developer and we'll train them up. So, you know, in our little way, I'd like to think that as a sector, we should be responsible enough to push the national interest and to minimize the zero-sum equation as much as possible.
So as I bring this panel to a close, I'd just like to summarise the key points that I've learned from this, and that is that Dr. Chris says that there's currently ongoing a consultation of the sandbox, so that's planned. They're focusing on the capital market strategy. They're working on other ideas, particularly around virtual assets. They're having detailed discussions with central bankers in the ECB around a framework for crypto assets. They're seeking a passport for depositories. It's prudent to ensure that the supervisory functions weed out the bad apples. They're pursuing supervisory convergence, or it's a theme that has been discussed at a high level for a long time. And high-level regulation is designed to be also there to create space for innovation. They're working on education as an institution. They're going to grow to 500 people within 2 years. And they also would like to invite other regulators over to learn, to continue innovating, etc. It's an issue of resources, and the University of Malta is key for graduates and how that develops. Marika then mentioned about the 53 years of Malta enterprise and how it's inviting more SME startups. She says the best way to set up in Malta is via multiplier. The big boys, and I'm sure girls, are welcome, but that they want the small ones too. All companies need to engage more, to engage with more than the MFSA. They want to introduce a business portal to condense communication with the 50 government agencies. She says the world of business is constantly changing, and any legal acts must keep up with that. And also to look at the principle of getting access to public documents rather than going directly to the people who have them. She said that she would like for the authorities to speak to each other more, and she's facilitating that. And also Malta Enterprise has been working a lot with the Ministry of Education. Matthew mentioned about the last 5 to 10 years of local economic growth and the wage inflation that it has brought. He says that most hires are done locally and at local scales, and that they, at the moment, they haven't hit or met Western rates yet and can't quite attract from East European on salary levels, but on other areas. He mentioned that white-collar migration has never been higher, and the workforce is increasingly made up of millennials where work-life balance is important, and Malta is as good a place as any to offer that. He said Malta is a hotbed of innovation and it's nimble. He said in particular that there's a lot of skills requirements and the education sector can't keep up. That brought a lot of comment from everybody else. The world of work is changing, he says, and scaling of talent happens remotely. And in particular that the recruitment industry builds a reputation or kills it very quickly. And finally, Andrew says that every parent wants to give their children good education. When you bring business, then you bring people. When you bring people, you bring their own respective requirements. He said that the videos don't necessarily reflect the default of expats that they want, particularly private schools, etc. He pointed out that Malta is very good in terms of the ease of doing business. He said that there's that in Malta it's between 1 to 2 degrees of separation. I think it's a fraction of that myself. Also, he said you can get to decision makers quickly, MFSA and otherwise. He says that in particular that other authorities deserve a mention, like the Gaming Authority and Communication Authority, and the 3 key opportunities or threats for Maltese growth is the banking environment is difficult, lack of HR and incremental innovation. So, can I ask you all to give my 4 panellists, Dr. Chris Buttigieg, Marika Tonna, Andrew Zammit and Matthew Camilleri, an appreciative round of applause.